Greetings. My name is Milton Griepp. I'm the CEO and publisher of ICV2. I want to thank GameCrafter for inviting me to speak today. This is my first time here, and so I'm excited to be here. And thanks for attending or for streaming this presentation. We're going to be talking about the state of the hobby games market in North America, specifically the US and Canada. And we're going to focus on annual numbers, but later on in the presentation we will I thought I was in a time loop. But later on, we'll be moving on to some of the events of early 2019 and talk a little bit about that. As background, I want to introduce ICV2. We cover the business of geek culture, focusing on key categories. Hobby games, the reason you're all here and the reason I'm here today, including collectible games, card games, the hobby portion of the board game market, miniature games, and role-playing games. We also cover comics and graphic novels, including manga, and we cover showbiz and merch tied to geek properties. On the web, we have a website, icv2.com, which I invite you to visit. We publish business news about the games business every business day. We also have a daily newsletter, the ICV2 Daily Insider. That summarizes the headlines from the previous 24 hours. So that gives you a one-stop digest every morning of the news from the previous day. You can subscribe to that right on our homepage. You can also follow us there on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or via RSS. We also publish a magazine, which comes out twice a year, and I've got some copies here at the end. There's some elements of this presentation that are included in the last issue of the magazine. You're welcome to take one. This magazine has actually been around since 1982. It was published by a distributor I was co-owner and co-founder of at the time, called Capital City Distribution. And ICV2, the source of that name, is Internal Correspondence version 2. That's why we have that name. So, turning now to the information I want to present about the state of the games market in North America. First of all, I want to explain where we get information. We do interviews with publishers, distributors, retailers, and others. All of those are important sources of information. Each of them has information that the other tiers do not have. We also look at the publicly traded company information. Occasionally in the Hasbro earnings report, they'll talk, for example, about what their Magic sales have done or their D&D sales. And there are other public companies, CMON's an example, Games Workshop is an example. NPD, which is a international data service that does POS tracking and uses consumer panels, also releases some information from time to time about the games business. And then we also look at Kickstarter data, and particularly we work with a company called ICO Partners that does analysis of the different parts of the games business on Kickstarter, and their annual numbers and semi-annual numbers are really good. And then we build up our estimates of the game market size by category. In other words, we go through one category at a time, try to figure out how big that is, and then add it all up at the end. So start with our definition. What is the hobby games market? For us, the hobby games market is games produced for a gamer market. That's obviously a subjective definition in some ways. They're usually, but not always, sold in the hobby games channel. In other words, hobby game stores, your friendly local game store. In our analysis of market size, we look at the market for those games regardless of which channel. So for example, Magic the Gathering is sold in hobby game stores. It's also sold in mass and specialty retail. And we estimate the size of all of those channels combined. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is US and Canada. So starting with, or talking about 2018 as a whole, first I want to mention a few macro factors that affected the market last year. First of all, we had a generally strong economy, and there's actually some difference of opinion as to whether that's good or bad for the games business. Certainly right after the crash in 2008, we saw some improvement in the games business as people started to cocoon more and spent more time at home. But in general, if the economy is good, people have more money to spend, and that's good for commerce of all kinds. So we had slow, steady growth last year, some income growth in addition to jobs growth, so a generally positive economic environment. On the negative side, specific to this business, we had the Toys R Us bankruptcy, which they shut down all their stores, which I believe at the time was about 700 through the first half of last year, and they were done by the end of the summer. And that was a very sudden shock to the market because it took a lot of stores out of the business suddenly. So for companies that sold through that channel, that was a real hit. And you saw it when Hasbro and Mattel reported their quarterly earnings through the end of last year and the beginning of this year. So in Toys R Us, they had some CCGs, a lot of board games. They were real strong in family games and games for kids, but they also carried some of the Asmodee titles and other titles you would think of as hobby game, board game titles. Wanted to talk about two other elements. One is publishers improved their online channel management. That had been a big issue in 2017 in particular and the years leading up to that. And by that I mean, how are they handling the products that were reaching the market through online channels? And there were a couple of problems there. One was price. Prices were getting cut to the point where local game stores couldn't compete effectively, and that was damaging to the channel. And also there were a lot of counterfeits flowing in. And through a number of techniques, the publishers started to get their arms around that. Minimum advertised price policies on the price side, and then working with the online platforms to find and root out counterfeits was another step they took. And so that was an improvement in the market in 2018, sort of in the structure of it. Then also, I think there's one other macro factor which actually started around the late aughts, which was that we seem to be seeing a secular change in public tastes toward looking for more person-to-person social connection. And the easiest explanation I have for that is people that look at screens all day at their jobs, when they go home, don't necessarily want to look at screens for recreation all day or all night. So they seek out friends that they can actually play games with across a table and interact with in real space. And that appears to be continuing. So this is a chart showing the last 6 years of sales in the hobby games market. Focusing on 2018 specifically, you saw about a 3% decline in the overall hobby games business last year, and that was driven entirely by a drop in the collectible games category. The others were all up. So we're going to drill down a little bit into these numbers. And the total we have for the hobby games market overall in the US and Canada is about $1.5 billion at retail. And as you can see, that's about double where it was in 2013. So it's been a really great run. Here's the way it looks on a graph. As I mentioned, it's been a great time to be in the hobby games business. And I see this largely as a reflection of that secular trend I talked about earlier, which is that desire for face-to-face interaction and face-to-face game playing. So 2018 was the first year of decline in a while, and there were some successful new introductions in the collectible games category, and we'll talk a little bit about drill down into the products specifically as we go on. A majority of products were still growing. Hobby games channel was still growing. And if I had gone back further, this growth spurt really started in the late aughts. So it's longer than this 6-year trend. It's closer to 10 or 11. And you can see that if you look at the hobby channel specifically. So this is the network of hobby game stores, what happened in your friendly local game stores over the last 10 years or so, 11 years, I guess, on this chart. And as you can see, the last year there was a decline in that channel was 2008. And every year since has had growth, some as high as 20%, several as high as 20%, and none of them below 5%. So really, really strong growth in the hobby game stores. And that's been good for them, good for the business, and a very positive trend. So this doesn't include chain retailers, doesn't include Amazon, just includes your friendly local game stores. And occasionally, some of them have significant websites associated with their stores, and there's a few of those included in this estimate. So if the overall hobby games business was down, but the hobby game stores were up, where was the decline? And the answer to that is mass merchants. So to understand this, we need to look at the categories that make up the hobby games business and their relative size. First of all, this is a bar graph that sort of illustrates the relative sizes. Collectible games are over 40% of the total hobby games business. So they're the most important part of the business, and certainly very important to the health of the hobby game store channel, because if collectible games don't do well, it's hard on them. Miniatures and board games together are about another 45%. So those two things together are about 85% of the business. The rest of it is card, dice, and role-playing games. Those two together are about 14%. Hobby board games as the number 3, used to be the number 3 channel. It's now the number 2 channel. That's a fairly recent trend. Games Workshop's obviously a super strong player in the miniatures business. They have a bunch of stores in the U.S., I think about 100, or in North America, I think about 100 now. So they had been driving the miniatures part of the business, but as probably most of you know, the hobby board games business has just exploded in the last 10 years. And I would also, I guess, just comment, look at these relative sizes, that there's a lot of misconceptions about these relative sizes. I think part of it dates back to 20 years ago or more, when RPGs were sort of the heart and soul of the hobby games business. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into the categories, but as you can see, they're the smallest part of the business, and not really, I mean, if they went away, the total business wouldn't change that much. Okay, looking at the individual categories, this is the collectible games business from 2013 to 2018. You see a peak in 2016, and last year we were about where we were in 2015. Still up, still good growth, but definitely off its peak. I want to define the category. Collectible games are defined by blind packaging. In other words, you buy a box of something or a pack of something, you don't know what's in it. So it's a little bit of a lottery ticket. The publishers, manufacturers use various rarity schemes, which have varying numbers of key elements of whatever their product is in the pack, and that gets people to chase them, buy more. And so the average buy at the consumer level on a collectible game is a lot. Probably would not be an exaggeration to say that if you're a serious player of a collectible game, you might be spending $1,000 a year on it. So this includes not only collectible card games like Magic and Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh!, also includes collectible miniature games, includes collectible dice games like Destiny. It includes blind pack minis, like the ones that WizKids produces for Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder. So all of those things together are the collectible games business. And so the biggest impact on this category was Pokemon, which had this huge peak in 2016 and then declined over the last couple. And that was really driven by Pokemon Go on the one hand, and then Pokemon's 20th anniversary, I believe, was 17, and that they really blew up their SKU count during that year. Put out a lot more product. They had a lot more facings in the big merchants, and so that led to big sales. Pokemon Go slowed down, and so now it's off its peak. In 2018, there was also a weak start for Magic the Gathering. That kind of turned around in late April with the release of Dominaria. And then we had some good introductions. I'd mentioned Keyforge, which came out around the end of the year, Transformers from Wizards of the Coast, Warhammer, which seems to have tailed off this year, but did well in 2018. You also had some of the games released in previous years, like HeroClix and Destiny, maybe slowing down a little in 2018. So now you can look at the graph and have a better feel for why it looks this way. This is non-collectible miniature games, so this doesn't include blind pack miniatures. It only includes the kind of miniatures that you buy in a form where you can see what you're buying each one. And those have been on a tear, doubling since 2014, and there's a couple factors for that. One is Games Workshop is the biggest factor. They're the biggest company in that business, and they've just been on a fantastic run with both their key brands. Both Warhammer Age of Sigmar and Warhammer 40K are doing really well, and they're producing a lot of games sort of around the core games that are doing well as well. There's also been very strong RPG related miniature sales. As D&D has grown, the sales associated with it have grown, and as miniature play has become more popular due to D&D, it's sort of spread out to other games in the category. We saw a little bit of a decline in Star Wars X-Wing, which had been a super strong brand in previous years, especially in specialty retail channels, and that was even in mass for some of those years. The second edition was launched late in 2018. That started to revive the brand, and there's a huge SKU count out there, so there's a lot of products. So it's still an important brand, but just not as strong, and part of that is I think just the game aging, and then secondly, Star Wars as a brand just isn't as strong as it was. Star Wars Legion was a strong launch in 2018. That's a real hobby-focused product. And you know, if you were going to look at the graph, the jump between 16 and 17, we now think maybe our 17 estimate was a little high, so maybe that growth is more spread out between the 2 years, but they were definitely both growth years. Let's look at hobby board games. Here we have a category that nearly quadrupled since 2013, and that's been the biggest factor in the hobby games market growth in the period. In 2018, we had the slowest growth rate in 6 years, so it slowed down a little bit. There was a massive proliferation of titles. That was felt very strongly at retail in 2018. Retailers really had a hard time dealing with the number of products out there. It made their sales choppy, hard to predict, ended up with unsold inventory at retail. So it was kind of a painful year, even though it was a growth year for hobby game stores. Lifespans declined. It used to be when the market wasn't as crowded, a new board game would go out there. It could take some time to find its market and sell over a long period of time. Retailers just don't have the luxury of doing that for a lot of games now. So it comes in, it doesn't start selling in the first month or two, it's gone. And that led to a flight to evergreens. There's certainly a lot of hobby board game titles that have been around for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And retailers knew those were going to sell, so they started devoting more space to those types of games. Asmodee in particular really started pushing their backlist and created an incentive program for retailers to stock their best backlist titles. And that corresponded to retailers seeing these trends, getting hammered on unsold inventory on some new products and deciding, hey, I'm going to stick with the stuff I know is going to sell. I'm going to sell Catan every week. I'm going to make sure I've got the Catan base game and as many of the expansions as I can carry on my shelves at all time. Supply chains improved, and by that I mean there were fewer games that came out and had a big flash and then were unavailable for long periods of time. From the year before, I would say Gloomhaven would be an example of that. $140 games selling like crazy, just not enough copies available consistently over time. Pipeline started to fill up a little better on some of the key games in 2018, so that was a positive. The hottest new games were still a problem, but overall, that was less of a problem than it was in previous years. So there's the picture again of what that looks like. Really, really nice curve, maybe slowing growth a little bit. So hobby card and dice games is a smaller category by our definition. It did more than triple, so its growth rate was only a little bit slower than the board games. So really strong growth, just smaller numbers. This is a tough category to define. We do include adult party games like Cards Against Humanity in this category. They obviously sell in multiple channels. A lot of them started out selling in online only and then maybe found their way into hobby, kind of spotty, and a lot of retailers just buying them off Amazon and marking them up to above online prices. And then they made their way into mass merchants eventually. So now you see Cards Against Humanity at all the big stores. I don't think it's in Walmart. They don't like that edgy stuff. Then there were a ton of new titles in this category, especially card games in 2018. Again, you saw some of the same phenomena where retailers went to the titles that they knew were going to sell and maybe slowed down their experimentation or made it more limited on new products. We think Cards Against Humanity probably crested in 2017. And again, the shape of my curve may be a little bit off, but I think the general trends are accurate, and I think the final number is close. So again, there's the shape of the curve. Let's talk about RPGs. This was actually the fastest growth rate of any of the categories. Smallest numbers, fastest growth rate, which that makes it easier to grow when you got a smaller number. You don't have to add as many dollars to get a faster growth rate. I think in the early aughts, those of you that have been in the business a while saw a big decline in the sales of role-playing games. Part of that was product. I always say content is king, and the products are primarily responsible for how they're sold. But you also saw heavy competition from video games during that period, which had very similar play to the historic role-playing game mechanics, and in some ways that nearly wiped out the RPG business in the early aughts, but it's now returning and really booming, and we'll talk a little bit more about the reasons. In 2018, growth rate in the hobby started to slow down a little bit in RPGs. It was still booming, still growing fast in the mass and specialty retail channels, but a little bit slower in the hobby. D&D has a super broad appeal. I would say its brand awareness is probably wider than it's ever been at any time in its history. And a couple of reasons for that. Media exposure, Stranger Things is probably the biggest thing that blew it up. And then the other factor is RPGs have always sort of been intimidating in terms of how do I learn how to play this? It seems so complicated. And being able to watch streaming play has been a big factor in the growth of the RPG business. Wizards of the Coast has said that over half of new purchasers of Dungeons & Dragons have watched it being played on a streaming site. So that's a really important source of customer acquisition and of sort of lowering the barriers to playing RPGs, which have been kind of intimidating over the years. At the end of last year, there was very heavy competition from the online retailers. Specifically, Amazon was selling D&D at over 50% off. So that was painful for the hobby game stores. They obviously have the added value of having play in their stores, and there's other reasons why people shop at hobby game stores, but on a price basis, it was a very, very competitive Christmas and not something that Wizards of the Coast seemed anxious to change. There was heavy title count growth during the year. Dungeons & Dragons has had a very deliberate, slow pace of new releases, but a lot of new titles or revived titles came into the market. Stores started to expand the amount of space they had for role-playing games. Again, as I said, at one time, that might be the only category of hobby games you'd see in some stores. That changed over the years to where that was a very small section. Now it's growing again with more titles than there have been for some time. We've got this pretty much a straight line. It's not so hard to get a feel for what's happening in the hobby games market. It's a little tougher to know what's happening in specialty retail, but we think this is probably fairly close to what the shape of the line looks like. And then I want to talk a little bit about Kickstarter, which I think for this group is probably a very important channel. We do include Kickstarter numbers in our estimates of the total market size using the information from ICO Partners and from some other sources. And this was kind of a shock to us when we looked at the year-end 2018 numbers, because we thought there was no way that tabletop games could continue to grow in 2018 in the Kickstarter, but they did. They were up 20% in 2018, accounting for about $165 million. So that's over 10% of the total hobby games business. And that actually went up in the second half. Part of that may be seasonal, but could be a bigger trend too. The number of projects was also up, funded projects was also up 20%. And just to give you some perspective on what's been going on over the last few years, tabletop games on Kickstarter has grown for 4 consecutive years. Kickstarter's been around for 7 years. Tabletop games have grown for 6 out of those 7. So super important category for Kickstarter. A great community has developed on Kickstarter for tabletop games. And so a really important source, not only of funding, but also of creativity, because it gives new game designers a way to reach out to consumers directly, get feedback, figure out what works and what doesn't. And so Kickstarter overall, I feel like, has been a really, really important, positive source of growth for the business. One kind of wild number is that tabletop games are 10 times video games on Kickstarter, which is sort of a flip of the overall market, not what you would expect at all. But I think part of that is lower cost of entry, so the projects don't have to be as big, but also just that community that's grown up around tabletop games on Kickstarter is feeding that growth and brings in more people all the time. Often, but not always, tabletop games funded on Kickstarter make their way to retailers. Not always. And I'm going to show you a chart of some of the top funded tabletop games of all time on Kickstarter. And there's a number of those that have not made it to retail. For example, number 1, Kingdom Death Monster 1.5, which funded at $12.4 million in 2017. That's never going to be sold at retail. Kind of a crazy number there. The average dollars per backer was over $600, which it's sort of a multi-year plan, releasing large numbers of miniatures over a period of time, and so you're sort of subscribing to miniatures that will come out over several years. But that's the biggest number we've ever seen in the tabletop games Kickstarters. Right under that, the second highest game is sort of the absolute flip of that. So much, much larger, like order of magnitude larger number of backers for Exploding Kittens. And the smallest dollars per backer, about $40 of any of the games in this top 10 all-time list. And so there's no single model that you need to be successful. And I think those 2 games really illustrate that. Exploding Kittens made its way to trade. And I don't know if you saw the news this week, but that company just raised $30 million from the Chernin Group to fund further expansion. They've done several other games. They're launching a game convention in Portland, Oregon. So they're going to do live events. They're going to launch more games. They're going to improve their distribution, which has been kind of spotty. That's one of the biggest fundings we've ever seen for a tabletop game company. And the place it came from is kind of crazy. Just when you look at it historically, the Chernin Group was a company that is behind the fund that invested in this. Chernin Group has invested primarily in tech and media companies. Their last 2 big plays were Crunchyroll, which is an anime streaming site, and Rooster Teeth, which created Ruby. They create original animated content. They just sold majority shares of those to AT&T, which folded them into Warner Media. So for them to come into the tabletop game business in some ways means we're entering a new era of potential external funding for tabletop game projects. And the quotes they gave, the Chernin Group gave at the time of the funding were things like, tabletop games are misunderstood. We see a lot of opportunity in this category. I think they may see opportunities to expand some of these products and IPs into broader uses in other media, so and in video games. That's a real game changer. And it all started on Kickstarter with The Oatmeal, which was a webcomic. Alon Lee, who's a game designer with a lot of history, coming together to create Exploding Kittens, which is funny and fun and clever. and inexpensive. And they brought in 219,000 backers, which is a pretty incredible number. I guess these other games, I see some heavily Kickstarter-oriented companies like CMON and Steamforged on here. And you see Gloomhaven. Now at number 10, they raised about $4 million. That game has done tremendously at trade. It's sold a multiple of what it did on Kickstarter at retail. So I want to talk a little bit about how 2019 started. And we're going to go through by category and talk a little bit about each category and what some of the trends have been this year. And these charts are based on spring 2019, which is January through April. We're working on the summer charts right now. Those will be up on our pro site within the next 30 days probably. So Magic and Pokemon, this is Hobby Channel. So this is what happened in hobby game stores. We're going to also talk about what happened in mass and then talk about overall for this category only. The rest will be only Hobby Channel. So in the Hobby Channel, Magic's number one, been number one for many years. Occasionally I'll run into a distributor. A couple of years ago I was running into distributors who were selling more Pokemon than Magic, but that was kind of an aberration and not a typical trend. Magic is king in game stores. Pokemon number two. Keyforge number three. I think in this period there were no new Keyforge releases. They were kind of riding their super strong release in late 2018 and just filling those pipelines. I think that Keyforge, based on what I was hearing about what happened to their first 2019 release in May, it's probably slowed down a little after that strong launch. We'll see how it ends the year. Yu-Gi-Oh, another really long-term product. I mean, Magic, Pokemon, and Yu-Gi-Oh are sort of the big three in this category, and they've both been around for over 20 years. Also have, in the case of Yu-Gi-Oh and Pokemon, have strong associations with other media. Those games both have really strong video games. They both have anime. They both have manga. And they have a strong merch stream also. Number five is kind of interesting because it's a collectible product associated with an RPG. Those are the collectible Dungeons and Dragons miniatures, D&D icons of the realms. Dragon Ball, super strong, probably 20-year property, anime property, and also strong video game background and a lot of merch. There's also manga. And Bandai relaunched Dragon Ball as a CCG. It's been around a couple times before, about 2 years ago for their new animated show, Dragon Ball Super. Transformers, I mentioned. Bushiroad's got three pretty strong games. Cardfight Vanguard is their strongest. Really strong international company. And this kind of Cardfight Vanguard we find is kind of regional. There's parts of the country where it's super strong, other parts where it's not as strong. But they definitely have a strong base in the US. HeroClix we talked about, and Star Wars Destiny we talked about a little bit. So mass channel, basically there's only 3 games really in the mass channel. I've started to see occasionally Dragon Ball Super and a couple of, I think I saw some at GameStop. So I'm seeing occasionally a few other games out there, but basically it's these 3. Pokemon's still number 1, Magic's number 2, and Yu-Gi-Oh's number 3. And that ranking is very consistent over the last few years. So you put that all together, we think Magic is bigger than Pokemon when you combine both the hobby game stores and the mass channels. So Magic, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, Keyforge, which is basically hobby only, and then the Icons of the Realms minis. And still that's kind of incredible to me because that's a collectible product. It's not a game. It's associated with D&Ds. So they're bringing in a lot of dollars through that collectible format and association with a strong brand. Non-collectible miniature games. I showed Kill Team on this slide as an example of a number of sort of we call them side games, but games that are associated with 40K or in that universe that maybe have a different starting point than the core 40K game. And that's been an important source of their growth. Once again, Age of Sigmar number 2. Again, you know, a lot of that goes through their own stores. They also have a direct-to-hobby retailer distribution program, and then they also sell through distributions. They're reaching the market every way they can, and they do a pretty good job of it. Number 3 is, again, another sign of the strength of D&D, which is the non-collectible D&D Minis line from WizKids. And then we have 2 Star Wars products at 4 and 5. We talked a little bit about X-Wing and Legion, so I won't go into those. I don't think they changed much in early 2019 versus late 2018. Okay, Hobby Channel board games. So the big game in this category is Catan. It's been number 1 on this chart almost all the time for as long as we've been doing them. And they have very broad distribution. Pretty much every hobby game store carries them, and they obviously have distribution in other channels as well. They have multiple SKUs, so once you buy the core game, there's other stuff to buy. A lot of people buy the 5 and 6 expansion, 5 and 6 player expansion, for example, but there's other maps that you can buy, and so there's more products. It has a really broad appeal. It's not that hard to learn how to play. I started knowing something was up when I was hearing from family members that played board games who never had any contact with the hobby game part of the world, saying, oh yeah, let's play Catan. So that was a new thing that started happening in the last 10 years. Of these games, Lord of the Rings was new from Fantasy Flight, had a good launch. Got Gloomhaven there at number 4. The $140 retail definitely helps that its position on the chart. These are all based on dollars. And it's had a really strong tail. You know, I would have thought at $140 there's a limited number of people that want to buy this, and they're all going to buy it as soon as they can get it. So as soon as the distribution channels started to fill up and it was generally available, I thought it would slow down quickly, but it hasn't. It's gone on for a long time, and the fact that it was still number 4 at the beginning of this year is surprising to me. Azul and Sagrada were both games that came out, I think, in 17. Took a while to fill up the pipelines, still doing well. Roots, a relatively new game. And then you see, I mean, Pandemic and Ticket to Ride are sort of the perennials on this chart. Been around for a long time, just sell and sell and sell. Multiple products associated with both of them, and so a strong family of games. Retailers know they can sell. And I was talking earlier about the flight to evergreens. They've certainly been a couple of the beneficiaries of that trend. Okay, card and dice games. Codenames has been at the top of this chart for a while, and we include both the core games by Czech Games editions, and then also the USAopoly licensed ones, where they kind of do a mashup of licensed property, code names, put them together. Here we've got pictured the Harry Potter version. Upper Deck does Marvel Legendary, obviously super strong IP, was headed into the release of the Avengers movie in this time frame. Z-Man's Love Letter, they sort of got their pipelines full again in the first part of this year, post-acquisition. They bought it from Alderac a while ago. The Mind from Pandasaurus, relatively new game. Binding of Isaac was kind of a surprise, did well. Dixit, Seven Wonders, Dominion, all long-time members of this chart. Super Fight, one of the Amazon-style games we talked about, or the games that started on Amazon and Kickstarter and then found their way to retail later. One of the things we find is those adult party games really surge around the holidays and then drop off the rest of the year, and you see that in this chart. If this had been the chart for the end of 2018, you would have seen those adult party games higher. And then RPGs. Dungeons & Dragons is probably an order of magnitude or more above the number 2 game on this chart. Just super, super strong and continuing to grow in the ways that we discussed earlier, stronger at mass and specialty retail than in hobby. Starfinder, surprisingly at number 2, but that's mostly because Pathfinder was way off during this period because they announced a new edition, which meant people sort of stopped buying the products from the current edition. That was eventually launched at Gen Con, so it'll be back up there later in the year. Star Wars products, there's a lot of them, and that's one reason that they show up at number 3, even though Star Wars isn't as strong an IP right now. Vampire came back in late 2018 and started to get their pipelines a little fuller in 2019. And that at one time was the number 2 RPG. There were times even it was probably ahead of Dungeons and Dragons over the last 30 years. Has been gone a while, now back. So we'll see whether they can return to the position they had in the past. And then Pathfinder, as I mentioned, was off as people waited for the new edition. So a few summary points about 2019. Started strong in the hobby. I think publishers say they cut back, but retailers and distributors said they couldn't see it. So I'm not sure if that was just more Kickstarter games coming in, or if some publishers were still increasing or staying the same while others were declining. I think everybody was trying to figure out ways to cut risks. Publishers were probably cutting their print runs for trade a little bit, cutting the number of titles they put out. Retailers were cutting their investment in inventory on new games, being a little more strategic about what kind of games they were going to carry. Distributors were more careful, not stocking as deep, basing more on pre-orders. Overall, it was a healthier business than it was at the same time in 2018 for retailers and distributors, but probably more challenging for publishers who were seeing those trends flow upstream. At the same time a year ago, I did these interviews probably in May and early June. In mid-June of 2018, everybody was complaining about how many releases there were and how are they possibly going to decide what to order, and they were getting burned on inventory that they bought that they couldn't sell. I was not hearing that at all in the same time this year, which means retailers have figured it out, they're managing their risk better, distributors have figured it out, so now the pain is on publishers and they have to figure it out. Appetites are shifting a little between categories and types of games. What I was seeing, especially Toy Fair, we see products for the year, $40 games. For the last few years, it's been who can push that price point up above $50 and up the best and be most successful at that. Now we're going to try to sell products that are right in sort of that family games pocket of $40 or less. And roll and write, which I still haven't been able to figure out why that's exploding, because I haven't been able to find the one hit that everybody's trying to emulate. But apparently there must have been one because there's a lot of roll and write games out there. On the negative side, at the publishing level especially, people are really nervous about the tariffs. And I don't think it's as much whether the tariffs exist or not as the uncertainty, because there's all this back and forth of are they going to happen, when are they going to happen, how much are they going to be, and how can you price something on a Kickstarter that's not going to be manufactured for months when you don't know what you're going to pay your manufacturer in China to import that product. We're continuing to see distribution shifts in the hobby trade. CMON went to Asmodee for distribution, so Asmodee just continues to expand its control over the hobby games business publishing side of things. Asmodee also made some shifts in the way it deals with distribution. They have a strategic relationship with Alliance Game Distributors, which distributes their products exclusively. But you saw a move toward Asmodee taking more of the largest accounts themselves and using Asmodee for the smaller accounts. Tough to say exactly where that's going to go, but it seems to be an ongoing trend, so I would expect it to continue. Something I didn't think I would see is that painting minis is cool, and I'm seeing it in places in media and stuff where you wouldn't have seen it before, and that's definitely a change, because that was a real niche part of the hobby games world that's now starting to get exposed to a broader audience. Biggest hit in the first part of the year was Wingspan from Stonemaier, which is actually hard to measure because the pipelines were like totally empty. We did a story in this issue of the magazine about how that happened, and because the company's been fairly upfront about the challenges they had dealing with predicting what their sales would be and then getting the pipelines full. And it's an interesting story in which nobody was happy because the retailers didn't have enough to sell, consumers couldn't get it, publisher wasn't happy, and when you read what he went through and how his decision-making process went, it's hard to imagine how he could have done it better. And big bottom line trend, which has just been continuing over time, is there's more people in stores. And that's such a big positive. You need people to play with to sell hobby games, and that trend continues in a positive way. So that is the end of my prepared remarks, and I'd be happy to take some questions. Yes?
For the role-playing, do you include sort of like one-book stuff too, like RPGs?
Question was whether we include digital in RPGs or we do not. Yes?
What do you think was behind the decline in the collectible card game from 2017 to 18?
Question was what was the cause of the decline in the collectible game business between 2017 and 18? And it was Pokemon, which had such huge years in 2016 and 2017 that it just wasn't replicable. And there were so many people. I know my son's in his early 20s. When he started playing Pokemon Go, he started to get back into the cards. He was buying cards. Well, that's all kind of faded now. I mean, he's still playing Pokemon Go, but he's not buying at the same level as he was. So I think Pokemon Go, which was the first huge AR game to kind of blow up, really drove that trend. Yes?
Have you seen any successful trends so far in trying to incorporate any level of digital into tabletop collectible games? There's been apps. I've also seen some digital boards, but I'm wondering if anything's been showing an actual trend toward.
Okay, so the question was, have I seen any successful efforts to incorporate digital components into tabletop games? And I think the answer to that is not yet. I keep expecting something to blow up, and we've seen some, modest successes. XCOM from Fantasy Flight did pretty well. There's some new, I think there's a new digital board on Kickstarter right now, at about a $300 retail. I've talked to them. There was a new demonstration. There was demonstrations at Gen Con of another digital play device or app. I keep thinking somebody's going to, find the magic combination. I mean, Jordan Weissman took a shot at it a few years back, and nobody's really caught it yet. And I don't know if that's inherent to the attempt. In other words, is it doomed to failure because if you want to play tabletop, you just want to play tabletop? Or is it just that nobody's got it yet and I don't have an answer to that? Other questions? Yes?
So you mentioned that the holiday season, the RPGs were hit, or the hobby stores were kind of hurting because of Amazon taking a lot of the business by undercutting them on RPGs. Are there other portions of the market that you're seeing Amazon and other online distributors sort of really taking away market from hobby stores?
Question was about online competition for hobby game stores, and are there areas other than, I mentioned Dungeons and Dragons at the end of last year, other than that area where Amazon is taking business from the hobby game channel? And I think the answer to that is yes. Companies have, but I go back to my comments about 2018 and the institution of minimum advertised price policies. So that helps. It requires constant monitoring. We did an interview on the site a year or so ago with a company, and there's a bunch of these companies that monitor online pricing and communicate it to the publishers and communicate it to the online platforms and say this violates your minimum advertised price and you have to take it down. A couple of reasons for why that stuff is happening. One is to the extent that these online platforms serve as a platform, they're not necessarily in control of pricing. There might be a third-party seller that's undercutting. Might be a retailer that has too many, for example, and they're trying to get rid of them. Also, you see price matching. So if an online seller on one platform is selling at a cheap price, all of a sudden, hey, Walmart and Amazon's online prices drop to match that because they just have robots spidering the web constantly and checking these prices and algorithms that determine how they price their products. So I guess overall it's better than it was a year or two ago, but I don't think it's ever going to go away. And for those companies that don't have a minimum advertised price policy like Wizards of the Coast, the competition can be quite extreme. Other questions? All right, great. I want to thank you all for coming. A couple of things if you want to get this kind of information. I have copies of the magazine here, which has a lot of the year-end information from 2018 and the early part of 2019. You're welcome to take copies of that. On the website, we have an area of the site called ICB2 Pro. That's subscription-based, $10 a month, $100 a year. But there's also a 2-week trial period, and it has my presentation from Gamma Trade Show, where JT first saw this presentation, and it has the audio and the slide deck, so you can also look at it there in your trial period, and hope you subscribe, but if you don't, that's fine too. So thank you very much, and thanks for coming.